I built this TTRPG Gaming Table with less than $400 in materials, and that includes the cost of the TV and zero prior experience. In this video, I'll show you how I did it and the many mistakes I made, including one very big, very expensive mistake. Also, at the end, I'll break down all the materials and their costs. So, let's get into it. The very first step of creating the table was coming up with a design. So I began by taking a 43-inch TV that I had sitting around the house that I planned to use as the centerpiece for the table, and I just measured its dimensions. So then I drew out a really rough sketch of the TV and table and wrote in the TV dimensions. And I'm gonna put a timestamp on the screen in case you want to just skip past all of the math, but if you want to know how I determined the table dimensions, here's how I did it. I knew I wanted 48-inch 2x4s running the width of the table, because that was half of the 8-foot long 2x4s I could fit in my car. I also had to add 1.5 inches to either side from the 2x4s running perpendicular, giving me a total table frame width of 51 inches. I subtracted the 22.25 inches from the screen and divided that number by 2 to determine I had 14.375 inches on all sides of the table. Then I just had to add that 14.375 inches to either side of the length of the TV, giving me a total TV table frame length of 67 inches. Okay, so if you skip the math, here you go. Here's the final diagram. You can see that my table dimensions were 51 inches wide and 67 inches long. Once I had my main table frame dimensions, I modeled up a design in Blender. I sent that design to a college buddy who has quite a bit of design and woodworking experience. Luckily, because he was so experienced, he was able to redesign my table from the ground up using CAD, greatly improving on the final design. Next, I went to my local hardware store for supplies, and while I was there, I found this really nice material called edge glue pine, and I decided to use 3 pieces of it instead of one large piece of MDF for the tabletop. So I grabbed 2 boards that were 16 inches in width for the sides of the table, and 1 board 24 inches in width for the center. Now that I had my plans in place, I began measuring and cutting wood. I started with the 2x4s that would run along the width of my table. I needed 4 of them total. 2 of them would work as anchors for the TV in the center of the table, and then the other 2 would be the edge of the table frame itself. So I measured those out at 48 inches exactly. Next, I measured the 2x4s that would be the length of my table, so I measured out and marked those at 67 inches. Once I had the 2 length 2x4s and the 4 width 2x4s marked and measured, I used a circular saw to cut them. You notice that I ran a second board behind the first so that the circular saw had something to cut into at the end. This keeps both sides of your cut nice and crisp and clean. And you can also notice I used something called a raptor square to guide the circular saw and make those cuts as straight as possible. Here I am framing out the long side of the TV. These boards only need to run the length of the TV itself because they will be screwed into the boards on the perpendicular side. And you can see I also placed a dummy board along the corner side of the TV so that I could make sure the angle was square. Originally, I was going to make these boards running along the top and bottom 2x4s as well, but I discovered I would have to cut into the material, so I kept them as 1x4s so that they would be thinner and easier to cut through. And once I had that marked, I used the circular saw to make those cuts. One thing I did discover was that this particular TV had a power indicator that created a gap, so I just measured that indicator out, got the depth and length of it, and put it into the 1x2 so that I can cut out that material, which I did so with a circular saw, a drill bit, and a jigsaw. It wasn't exactly beautiful, but it's in a position where no one will see it, so I wasn't too worried. I should also note that I used pocket holes on all of the perpendicular joints. This is because if you go in through the side of one piece of wood and into the end face of another, not only does it have a chance to crack the wood, it's also a less strong bond, so pocket holes tend to be the way to go. Once I had all the boards cut, I next laid out the pieces into the correct layout just to ensure that they all fit together and that I wasn't missing anything, and it all looked good. So then I removed all the pieces that weren't the central frame. I took my TV and set it inside to make sure it was all good. I checked to make sure my corners were straight, and that it was equal on both sides so that the TV would set in the middle of the table. I marked the edges, applied wood glue, and set the 1x4 into place, then used an extra block to keep the board at a right angle while I drilled in the screws. Then I set the frame carefully down and did the same to both sides of the opposite end. With the frame for the inner TV complete, I then began to construct the frame for the outside of the table, using the same method of making sure the corners were straight, and gluing the edges, and then finally drilling in the pocket screws in each corner. When I tried putting the two pieces of the frame together, I actually realized I had a bit of a problem. For some reason, the boards would not fit inside correctly, so I just had to temporarily take them out, and I made a very slight cut to the ends of the boards, and then finally, after a couple of adjustments, I was able to fit it inside. I then measured the space between the edge of the table and the TV, and once I verified that those were equal, I went ahead and screwed the frame into place, which was actually pretty tricky to do just because of the angle. In fact, I found it was impossible, so to my dismay, I had to dismantle the inner frame and rebuild it in place. So, learn from my mistakes, build your inner frame inside of the outer frame, make your life easier. Alright, framing is done, that's huge. So now, I think the next step is we're gonna make the legs. The legs were made out of 4x4 pine, which I measured out to 30 inches. Unfortunately, because of the width of the 4x4, I went through once on a circular saw, but could not cut all the way through. So after making a couple of those initial cuts, I used a handsaw to cut through the rest, which took a really long time and was a lot of hard work. After doing that 4 times, I took each post and put it into each corner, and it was beginning to look a little bit like a table. Next, I took a 2x2 piece of lumber and cut it into 8 identical pieces, 3.5 inches long. These pieces were used to help brace the legs in place. I pre-drilled some holes and then put in 3 screws per brace, 2 going on top and bottom in one direction and 1 going through the center of the other. This next step was probably the most difficult for me as a beginner. I had to make 4 miter cut 2x4s at 45-degree angles, each of them 13 inches in length on the long side. These were used to further brace each corner leg, again putting screws through pre-drilled holes. And once I finished the last corner, it was time to flip over the table. Next, I measured the 1x4s that would support the TV from underneath. So I marked their lengths, made the cuts, and finally glued and screwed them into place. And this is what the supports looked like from underneath once I was done. Around this time, I also measured and cut a handy panel to cover the bottom supports of the TV. Also, it's this part where I did something really, really stupid. Alright, so I just turned on the TV, and yeah, I think I need a new TV. So yeah, that was a big expensive mistake. I think the fact that it was an older TV made me kind of reckless. If I could go back in time, I would be much more careful with the TV while I was doing all of this construction around it. And while we're on the topic of caution, you should only ever undertake a project like this if you are a safe and responsible adult. So going back to the build, I next cut 8 8.5 inch pieces out of the 2x2. These were added along the table in various places to add additional support and bracing for the tabletop. I first clamped them down with wood glue, and then later screwed them in so that they wouldn't fall down, like that one. With the frame and legs done, the next step was to put on the tabletop itself. The 2 16-inch wide pieces of edge-glued pine were perfect to create an overhang, but the centerpiece at 24 inches had to be cut down to 22.25 inches so that it could properly fit over the TV screen. To do this, I just clamped down one of the 16-inch boards to give the circular saw a guide to follow, but because I only had one shot, I was still pretty nervous. I next put the 16-inch panels into place and then slid in the newly trimmed middle section. I knew I would want to cut the center panel into 3 pieces so that I could remove the middle section to expose the screen. I used where the screen started as a mark for the table, and then I used a long piece of wood which I made sure was straight on both sides. Then I clamped it down and used it as a guide for the circular saw cut. Then I just did the exact same process to the other side of the middle section to create my 3 pieces. Then I just had to take the piece and make sure that the correct positioning was up so the wood grain matched. That night, I glued the 2 side pieces to the back middle section, creating a U shape. I also used sandpaper starting at around 150 grit and then worked my way up to about 220. This gave me a nice smooth surface on which to apply first wood conditioner. I just coated it evenly across all the wood of the build. I followed the directions of the can, letting it dry, and then I began the actual process of staining. Now, I started with a small sample piece of wood to ensure that I liked the color, and once I verified that, I just started working on one small patch at a time, covering each section with a light stain. After finishing the legs, I finally glued on the tabletop using wood glue and then clamping it down. I used wood conditioner on the surface just like on the sides. Then again, working in small sections, I stained the tabletop. I wasn't super happy with how it looked after the first coat, but by the time I finished the second coat, I was pretty proud of what I accomplished. I left the wood on the DM side of the table removable, so that way I could easily access the center wooden panel to cover or display the screen. I drilled holes into both the frame and the tabletop to insert pegs to lock the wood into place. Now I didn't want to lay figurines directly onto the screen because I was afraid it would scratch it, so instead I took a clear piece of plastic from a 27 by 40 inch poster frame and cut it down to the correct size to cover the TV and bevel. To do this, first I measured and then made a very light score with an X-Acto knife. Then I retraced that line with more pressure, creating a bit of a perforated edge that I could snap away. I had to be careful because if I bent too hard, it had the potential to crack the plastic. For anyone trying this at home, I would definitely recommend doing a practice cut before going to your final dimensions. This is an extremely delicate process that must be done carefully, both to avoid cracking the plastic and to avoid injuring yourself with the X-Acto knife. To display images, I hook the TV up to my laptop directly with an HDMI cable, and then I either use free software called OBS to project images directly to the TV, or for animated maps, I really like software called Dungeon Alchemist. Not only can you create maps within the software, but you can also browse the user-generated library to see what maps other people have created, and they tend to be really great quality. So I'll put the link to Dungeon Alchemist in the description. So yeah, overall, I'm extremely happy with how the table turned out. There are some bells and whistles I might add in the future, like cup holders or dice trays, as well as an airflow system for the screen. And oh, you probably noticed that the central section of the screen and the table have yet to actually be stained. That's because I have something special planned for it. I might add those things in a part 2 if this video is successful, so please share, like, or comment if that's something you'd like to see. And lastly, here's an exact list of materials and their cost, which I'll also put down in the description. The total came out to about $332.92 before tax, or $366.21 after. It would have been less than $250, but I had to buy a new TV. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.